Thank you for joining the General Board of Church and Society for Justice Talks, our witness on Capitol Hill. My name is Linda Bloom, and I serve as the Interim Communications Director for Church and Society. This is the third installment of our Justice Talk series. Our previous conversations offered a look ahead to 2021 and a focus on international concerns. Recordings of the first two webinars can be found on our YouTube page at UMC Justice. We'll include a link to that in the chat. Today's conversation will provide some insight into our witness on Capitol Hill and also speak to the history of the United Methodist building and the agency itself, the how and why we do what we do. As you think of questions during the conversation, feel free to drop them into the Q&A box. Our colleague Amber will be making note of the questions, and we will be getting to them later in the webinar. Now, let me introduce those who are part of today's conversation. The Reverend Susan Henry Crow is the General Secretary of the General Board of Church and Society. She has served as the agency's top executive since 2014, after 22 years at Emory University. For 16 years, Susan also served as a member of the United Methodist Judicial Council, the denomination's Supreme Court. She was the first woman elected president of Judicial Council, serving in that role from 2008 to 2012. Ordained an elder in the United Methodist Church, she continues to be a member of the South Carolina Annual Conference. Susan has a passion for enjoying and understanding communities and cultures around the world. She directed 30 and led at least 10 ecumenical and interfaith trips, looking at the root causes of conflict in places as varied as Northern Ireland, Israel, Palestine, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Africa, and in the US, Appalachia, and 2 Native American communities in Montana. She also loves architecture and understands that buildings, such as the United Methodist building, are signifiers of identity and mission. Mark Harrison is the Director, of Peace and Justice Program and Special Assistant to the General Secretary. He also promotes Peace and Justice Sunday, one of the United Methodist Church's 8 special Sundays. Mark has lived and worked throughout the world. He's worked with those living in some of the poorest parts of the world. He's seen the aftermath of war and the devastating loss of friends, family, and communities. He also has seen firsthand how faith can aid the work of peace and justice. Mark also reveres the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the marches to end racism and segregation are embedded in his soul. Amy Hong is the Senior Executive Director of Education and Engagement. She facilitates and custom designs seminars for diverse groups on issues of justice and peace. Amy has always been interested in the intersection of social justice and living out one's faith. Growing up in the church, she heard God's call, but felt the church was silent on how to engage in social justice. A Candler School of Theology graduate, Amy has actively incorporated justice and peace into faith formation and curriculum, both on the local level as a pastor and education director, and with the larger church body as director of the United Methodist Seminar Program. And finally, Dr. Jessica Smith is the Senior Executive Director for Research, Planning, and Spiritual Formation. She advises church and society leadership on strategic decisions related to our ministry, using tools of research and theological reflection she honed while earning her doctorate in theological studies from Emory University. Jessie believes research and planning to be part of the vital spiritual discernment of the organization. Her current research interests include spiritual practices in contemporary life, spiritual discernment, and cultivating methods of listening in Christian life. She enjoys leading theological and biblical reflection related to justice, as well as engaging in interfaith scriptural reasoning. Jessie serves on the board of directors of the Shalem Institute for Spiritual Formation. So let's start the conversation. Susan, can you tell us a bit about the United Methodist building and its significance on Capitol Hill?
Thank you, Linda, and good afternoon, evening, or morning to all of you. For 99 years, the Methodist building has stood on the Hill in DC as a beacon of hope and justice, representing the Methodist Church's stands on justice. Clarence True Wilson had a vision for this Wesleyan presence and this building dedicated to seeking justice and pursuing peace. His amazing daughter, Ms. Mary Beth Collins, who some of you probably know, of blessed memory, who passed at the age of 97 a few years ago, continued his vision for justice. I urge you to read Valiant for Truth. It tells part of the story. Also, if you can learn more about Ms. Collins' life, you would be edified. And we at GBCS hope to have a new history of GBCS that will be published in the next few months. There is a long history of the Methodist Church's presence and voice in this seat of power, advocating for justice and peace. For nearly a century, Methodist people come to the Hill to advocate for democracy and justice and peace out of our Methodist commitments. And I am sure that many of you listening today have been part of those trips. 100 Maryland Avenue is more than an imposing edifice standing strong beside the Supreme Court of the United States and across the street from the Capitol. It stands as a witness, a presence, a light on a hill, with a voice of Christian faith and Methodist social teachings, even in the midst of all things that come in life to the body politic: turmoil, infighting, nobility, grief, joy, uncertainty. A few of the moments that I hold dear are the times when I have represented you. Praying in the rotunda upon the deaths of Senator John McCain and President George H.W. Bush and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Representative John Lewis. I've also walked alongside of Cynthia Abrams as she worked for equitable health care and would be working for the equitable distribution of the COVID vaccine today. Or John Hill as he followed the federal budget's impact on those living in poverty year in and year out. And there is nothing more fun than walking around Capitol Hill with Mark Harrison, who knows everyone and greets his friends with laughter and joy and pushes daily on the importance of signing on to some specific letter. Meeting with the White House staff and senators and members of Congress to advocate for the values and principles we hold as core to our faith is the work that happens here. We are who we are because of John Wesley, living out our faith, seeking justice, pursuing peace. You know that justice and social holiness is at the heart of our Wesleyan identity. There is no holiness but social holiness. This is our ministry and our calling and our joy. Last week, Representative Lloyd Doggett from Texas stood on the steps of the United Methodist building, warmly acknowledging his life in the United Methodist Church and thanking us for the building's presence. We want to give you a chance to hear from one with whom we work, our dear friend, Representative Emanuel Cleaver. Representative Cleaver is a member of the United States House of Representatives. He is currently representing Missouri's 5th Congressional District, where he has served since 2005. Representative Cleaver served as pastor at the St. James United Methodist Church for 32 years, and he was elected as Kansas City's first African-American mayor in 1991 and has served as chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus.
We've come to a very meek moment. At least we've had a meek moment over the last 15 years or so in the church. We've been overpowered by the televangelists and the radio preachers, and we've become intimidated and silent. And if you look back in the history, that's what we've done over the past 25 years or so is antithetical to what John Wesley did and the great preachers of our tradition. But to some degree, because we do have a Washington office, it provides us with a chance to provide guidance for the church. The church must be the headlights rather than the tail light. And I think we've been the tail light much too often. But the fact that we have an office right next door to the United States Supreme Court, right across the street from the House of Representatives, provides us, I think, with a unique opportunity to disseminate information around the country about the major issues coming up before us. You know, the most beautiful part of our social principles and creed is that it ends by saying that we believe that God and His will are going to eventually triumph. We believe that God's will be done. We know that ultimately we're going to have peace. We know that ultimately war will be eliminated. We know that ultimately we're going to have a nation where children are protected. And we know that ultimately we're going to have a world where people are not battered and beaten and bludgeoned because of their skin color. We know that. And the only question is what role we will play.
Oh, okay, I think it's my turn.
It's your turn.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jessie Smith, and I am going to give you a whirlwind tour of what I have learned related to the history of the building. So if you just want to give me 1 second, I can share my screen. Okay. So first I want to thank the staff at the General Commission on Archives and History for their hospitality and expertise in archival work. I also want to acknowledge that Amy here on the panel with me, Amy Hong, has worked with me, and I want to thank her for that, as well as other staff. Like any effort as human beings, the building's history is, on the one hand, an incredible testament to the vision of Methodists in the early 20th century. And on the other hand, it can help us understand how we might reach even further for a public witness that learns from its past. The property was developed by the Board of Temperance, Prohibition, and Public Morals. To give you some historical context, when the board was constructing the building in 1923, the US Supreme Court building had not been built yet. Just a few years prior, in 1920, the US had passed the 18th Amendment prohibiting the use of intoxicating liquors. As many of you know, Methodists played a major part in the broader coalition of groups that worked to pass this law. and prohibition was on the books through 1933. As many of you know, Methodism was still fractured between the Methodist Episcopal Church and Methodist Episcopal Church South, and had been since the Civil War. As Bobby McLean has thoroughly demonstrated in his scholarship, Methodism in America was founded and included African Americans. Yet the church's history paints a painful picture of bigotry, discrimination, and racism since its beginning. The Evangelical Church and the Church of the United Brethren in Christ were still separate denominations and would not become the Evangelical United Brethren until 1946. The Evangelical United Brethren, or EUB, would eventually merge with the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1968 to become the United Methodist Church. The Commission of World Peace, later to become a board, and the Board of Social and Economic Relations are two predecessor bodies that joined with the Board of Temperance to become what we call the General Board of Church and Society today. At the time of the building's construction, the Commission of World Peace was headquartered in Chicago and was very concerned with international affairs, disarmament, and was responsible for the care of Methodists who registered as conscientious objectors. The Church Center for the United Nations building in New York had not been built yet. The Board of Social and Economic Relations was eventually founded in 1952 and was also headquartered in Chicago and tasked with working on issues of housing discrimination, racial integration of public schools, civil liberties, and civil rights. At the time of the creation of the Board of Social and Economic Relations, an interagency commission on Christian social relations was developed, in which representatives from the three boards met to relate to one another. I want to focus on three aspects of the life of the building that I think are themes that carry up until the present day. The first is that we are a meeting ground for people of faith, government, and public life to meet. The second is that we have been engaged in the concerns of the day related to peace and justice. And the final piece is that we have consistently worked with global partnerships. The building was from the beginning a place that saw itself as a real meeting ground for public life. At the dedication ceremony of the building in January 1924, public figures of the time like William Jennings Bryan attended, as well as the governor of Pennsylvania. A message from President Calvin Coolidge was delivered, considering acknowledging his regret that he could not attend the service. But as you can see in President Coolidge's letter to Bishop McDowell, the president of the Board of Temperance, Prohibition, and Public Morals at the time, President Coolidge wrote, "The dedication of this structure to be devoted to the organized work of one of the great church denominations for the promotion of public morals in the broadest fashion seems to me to be a significant event." Then he says, "It will visualize to all here in the nation's capital the definite and concrete aim to maintain our institutions on the firm moral basis upon which the founders intended them to stand." At the time of the groundbreaking for the 100 building, it was home to the board and also housed Methodist offices for resident bishops, district superintendents, and other temperance offices. Our relationship with public officials and figures continued and expanded when we built the 110 Maryland Avenue property in 1931. By 1953, the entire complex had 67 apartments, a chapel, dining room, and laundry. 3 Methodist bishops, 21 senators, representatives, and others connected with Congress, 10 Library of Congress employees, 17 government employees, and 2 from the Supreme Court were all tenants. In 1954, the chapel was where the Washington Methodist Preachers Meeting was held twice a month, and Lenten services sponsored by the board and the Methodist chaplains were offered to the Capitol Hill community. The chapel was then rededicated in 1954 with some updates, and a Wednesday worship service at noon was offered, something we continue to do today. The second piece to note is that we have been consistently engaged in social concerns of the day related to peace and justice. Some of the major issues that the Board of Temperance attended to was not only the prohibition of alcohol sales, but also very concerned about gambling and wanted there to be laws barring interstate commerce of gambling devices. They were also concerned about media that was deemed indecent. For decades, we called on United Methodist to engage in Commitment Day, a time when congregants would pledge to abstain from alcohol. And also for many years, we were worried about alcohol on military bases. And by the 1950s, concerns both on regulations on alcohol in airlines and drunk driving were part of our concern. So we have our concerns related to economic and social life continued. We raised concerns about handguns in the US in 1977 and spoke out against the death penalty. We stood with those who were seeking asylum and refugees from Central America and encouraged churches to join the sanctuary movement. We were concerned with energy bills in the 70s, rising unemployment in the 1980s. In the 90s, the passage of the American Disabilities Act, the Council of Bishops' initiative to fight drugs and drug violence, the AIDS epidemic, access to healthcare, passage of the Violence Against Women Act, racial disparities around crack and cocaine sentencing, and support for a cigarette tax are all part of what we worked on in the 90s. Here are just a few pictures from that time, advocating for control around handgun use, and a picture of Jesse Jackson. We have also been deeply concerned about civil rights. In the 1920s, we were speaking out against racial violence. The annual meeting of the board in 1924 passed a resolution on lynching, stating that lynching is murder and an offense against God, and then wrote, "Therefore, be it resolved that we congratulate Christian people throughout the country on the awakening conscience of the country in regard to this sin, that we urge the extension of the principle of interracial cooperation, and that we pledge our effort in every way and at all times to the early entire abolition of this monstrous evil." Our attention to civil rights only intensified and grew stronger throughout the 20th century. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom of 1963, the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, the March in support of making Martin Luther King's birthday a holiday in 1982, the March for Jobs, Peace, and Freedom in 1983, the Silent March in 1989, a call for an emergency consultation on racism and a joint statement on the Rodney King trial in 1992, and the Million Man March in 1995. We have also always been very attentive to emerging issues, things like genetics. The effects of industrialization and the environment have been seen as concerns as early as the 1950s. Reproductive justice and human sexuality are all concerns that we have paid attention to. Native American and Indigenous peoples have also been very important for our work. In 1973, we supported the negotiations between the United States government and the American Indian tribes that were on Pine Ridge Reservation, demanding that the US honor its land treaties. In 1978, we supported the longest walk of Native American representatives walking from California all the way to the nation's capital, advocating for changes in Native American legislative policy. In 1990, we celebrated with a planting of a peace tree. Here we see Tom Whitewolf Fassett with Chief Jake Swamp and celebrating the planting of this peace tree right outside on the grounds of the United Methodist building. Militarism and US federal budget have always been a major part of our concern since the 1950s. As you can see, we paid attention to what part of the budget, the federal budget, was being allocated for military expenditures. So there was always a real attention to how the federal budget impacted the US's work and military presence. In September of 1962, just to give you an example, the first 30,000 names on Methodist petitions in the race for peace were presented to the White House. And this was a call for a presentation that President Kennedy made to the United Nations, calling on there to be rather than there be an arms race, there be a race for peace, where there would be a nuclear test ban treaty, safeguarded disarmament. And of course, by this time, from the 1940s through this time, the United Methodists were very influential in the development of the United Nations, as well as the development and creation of the Church Center for the United Nations. So at this point, we had been very much involved for quite a few decades. Also in 1965, we held peace vigils and met with the Pentagon concerning Vietnam. We issued, as you can see, the Council of Bishops statement on the end of the Vietnam War. We supported the General Conference. Oh, we also were in dialogue and interviewed as you can see, the Deputy Director of the African National Council in 1975 around some of the violence that was happening in what we would call Zimbabwe. In 1980, we had a general conference that was right in the midst of the Iran hostage situation. And we worked with general conference delegates to meet with President Carter and send a message to President Carter and the Ayatollah calling for peace. In 1986, we worked again on calling for a better relationship with Nicaragua, and against sort of the ways that we had been aiding the militarism in Nicaragua. And in 1993, we supported the end of apartheid in South Africa. And here's a great picture of Bishop Desmond Tutu at the United Methodist building. And he just looks so happy. I just really love that picture. And finally, we worked on it, had a delegation to Northern Ireland in 1996. A few other things that are important to note is that the board at the time when it was created in the 1920s published a magazine called The Voice, and under the name of editors listed representatives around the world from France, India, Japan, Italy, Austria, Hungary, Switzerland, Germany, the Baltic states, and Mexico. So it's important to see how the board has in many ways been intentional from the beginning to recognize global partnerships in its work. Now, I don't want to pretend like there aren't things that may feel quite uncomfortable for us today. and that we do have legacies that we must reckon with. We did, certainly during the early years of our work, exhibit strains of anti-Semitism, anti-Catholic sentiment, and anti-immigrant sentiment. Leadership was dominated by white male perspectives. And there were some perhaps unintended consequences of the prohibition movement, which historians have named, including how prohibition contributed to the expansion of the penal system and served as a predecessor for later generations' war on drugs, which proved disastrous, as you know. So there are things we need to be honest about in our history, things that I hope we can learn from. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. I learned a lot from that presentation. Wow. I've been around this board agency more than 20 plus years. And I didn't know all of this. And the next time the Peace for Justice coordinators come to town, we're going to make sure you give a similar presentation. Again, my name is Mark Harrison. I'm the director of the Peace for Justice program, and I'm just going to lay out for you a little about how we do advocacy. Our advocacy is based on the United Methodist resolutions, come from this book right here. All right, look how many pages that is, right? We also have social principles. Even though this has 220 on it, these principles are still in existence until we meet again. And so this is how we do our background for our work and advocacy. Our biblical understandings: to do justice, love one another, fight oppression, repair communities ground us in our advocacy work. I always see our work. One way to look at our advocacy work is that this is Jesus in the public square. We center our advocacy and legislative priorities through a racial justice lens and equity, rather a racial justice and equity lens and framework. You can find our legislative priorities on the GBCS webpage, or you click here as you go to what you can do, and then you'll see another click for advocacy, and it'll show you our legislative priorities, which include climate, ending poverty, immigration, voting rights, and global access to COVID vaccines. We work with faith partners and civil society groups on legislation because we can't do it by ourselves. We partner with United Methodist Women and the General Board of Global Ministries. Some of you on this call may also be familiar with Ecumenical Advocacy Days. That's the time we come together once a year as United Methodists and our ecumenical partners to meet and strategize and do heal advocacy. And we have been doing that from before there was Ecumenical Advocacy Days. I'm just going back to Jesse's history. We also participated in another gathering before we created Ecumenical Advocacy Days. We attend meetings with members of Congress and the administration. We have presented testimony to congressional committees, and Congress and the administration, they do want to hear from us because they see faith voices as people who make presentations, not just for themselves, but for others. All right, so we're not in it just to protect ourselves. Even though we do have a person who looks out for our pensions. All right, and that is for us. That's lobbying. Because lobbying is when you fight for yourself. Advocacy is when you fight for somebody else. That's some terminology that sometimes gets used. I just want you to know this is an important week. Major votes are going to take place on Build Back Better legislation. This legislation includes priorities that are important to us, from poverty, immigration, and climate. We'd like for you to urge your members of Congress to support the reconciliation bill of $3.5 trillion over a 10-year period. That is, you're not going to spend $3.5 trillion in 1 year, so it's over a 10-year period. And the bill also includes provisions on how to pay for it. Some events also influence our work and our advocacy. There can be police killings, wars, Haiti right now, pipeline construction on Native American lands, So we may set priorities at the beginning of a year, a legislative priority, but events do happen, and we feel that we have to respond. I just want to say some key Black community priorities have not yet been addressed. That is, they have not become law. I saw someone's put in the chat about policing reform. Policing reform, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is now considered dead. But we are hoping to work with United Methodists to engage on policing reform in your states and in your localities. More will be forthcoming. That is, we're not going to just do nothing. Also, the issues of voting rights still have not been voted on yet and approved in law. And there's a plan that's working on for reparation for those of us who have a past of slavery and other repercussions. That legislation still has not been acted upon. We work, central conferences do influence what we do in our advocacy, in the administration, and on Capitol Hill. We have United Methodists who are concerned about conflict and human rights, particularly in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Philippines, the Korea Peninsula. So when these persons come, we have set up meetings for them with the administration. We've also set up meetings with them to meet with members of Congress and various committees. One United Methodist came to the town to talk about a situation in his country. This country was a DRC. And during his presence, he stayed over and he was able to give testimony on what was happening in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Our advocacy journey takes us to the White House, US government agencies, and the UN, as you heard earlier. It also includes traveling to places in the US and around the world to help staff have a better understanding of the issues of the day and as we do our advocacy. The United Nations building is a treasure for our advocacy. God bless our ancestors who made this possible. The sign on the front of the building is seen by tourists, even demonstrators. They take pictures of the sign. They tweet about the sign. Washington Post even wrote an article about our sign. Members of Congress talk about the sign. They walk past our building. Congressional staff walk past our building and see that sign. And they talk about that sign when they go back into their offices. So that is a blessing that our building has made possible by its location. So God bless our ancestors. Let me see. Also in our building, the coalition groups have hold meetings in the building. There have been press conferences at our building. And I remember we were having this event and we were looking at a commemoration for the building. So this guy from the Baptist church said, well, thank God United Methodist built that building, because if Baptists had built that building, we need to have guards at the building and say what Baptist could come in and which one couldn't. And everybody fell out laughing when he said that. So, so I just want to say, we do our advocacy with you. We cannot do this without you. So we have no PAC. United Methodists have a PAC. All we have is our members, and you are our strength. And we have put together a publication for you, Creating Change Together, a toolkit for faithful civil engagement. And you can find this also on our webpage. So thank you for listening to me, and I'll pass it on to our next presenter.
Thanks, Mark. Your energy is contagious. So yeah, I just also want to say thanks to Jesse and to Susan for sharing about the building. Knowing that the building is approaching its 100th year, I often wonder sometimes if the walls could talk, like what would they say? And just hearing a little bit from what you guys have both shared, or the three of you guys have shared, it's amazing. And just the great presence that the building has had in the past, but looking into the future of how the work that we currently do and what we will do in the future will also be inscribed in the walls of the building. So I'm happy to share some of my reflections on how the building and our location amplifies the work that we do. So my name is Amy Hong, and I serve as the Senior Executive Director of Education and Engagement. And I have the privilege of working with seminar groups. So for the past almost 8 years, I have been doing that. And it's been amazing to connect with annual conferences, local churches, United Methodist women, colleges, and seminaries. I might be leaving some groups out, but within the past 5 years, we've also been doing called seminars. And so I've been able to firsthand see groups prepare for their meetings with their congressional representatives, equipped with the information that they learned. And I see individuals excited or nervous as they prepare for their meetings. And then I see them come back with excitement and hope that when they come back from their meetings with their senators and House representatives, or they're completely fired up from a conversation that didn't go as well as they wanted it to, and even more eager to continue the work of advocacy and civic engagement. And I definitely think that our physical proximity to the Senate and House buildings allow us to have that impact because it really is just right across the street. So yes, Mark, I completely agree with you. Our ancestors had an anointing to see what this physical place would be like for us today. I think, also of the press conferences that we have had in front of our building. I also think about all of the interns that experience the life of Capitol Hill from a United Methodist perspective, and really just in awe of how that experience will impact their calling and their life. I think of seminar participants that come to DC for a seminar and learning for the first time that there is a United Methodist building on Capitol Hill. And there is a sense of pride in that. We've also had, at the annual Young Clergy gatherings, groups will walk across the street and meet with Chaplain Black, the Senate chaplain at the Capitol building, and hear how he provides spiritual and faith formation and guidance to the senators, which is something that I think we usually don't think about when we think about senators. Or the time when a group of bishops met with Chaplain Black in his office and they laid hands on him and prayed for him. There is something that provides this kind of a different perspective, perhaps a deeper experience. And we can provide that because of the proximity to where we are located. And it goes without saying, but it also provides a place to gather to do the work of advocacy, like Mark mentioned. There are key moments when our voice can make a difference, and in partnerships with our coalitions, we're able to gather with the advocacy fly-ins, trainings, and when we are able to host for different groups. Like when the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina spoke before the US House of Representatives on tribal recognition. But it's also not a place for United Methodists just in the US, but also a place for central conferences to speak with the US administration. And I think this was who Mark was alluding to when he mentioned the DRC, but when Bishop Natambo came and spoke for the US House Foreign Affairs Committee on the violence that the Congolese were facing. So I think about how lucky we are to have a presence on Capitol Hill, that we are able to meet and have a place to gather for these important moments. Also, just wanted to repeat something else that Mark mentioned, is the sign. A lot of people walk by and the sign, they may see the building and may not really know what the work that is happening inside the building, but the sign is, also doing the work of being a prophetic witness to all those that walk right by. And our location of the building magnifies the impact of the work that we are doing. Just as a wrapping up kind of reflection before we go to Q&A with Linda, there are moments when I'm standing in front of the United Methodist building and see the Capitol building and see the Supreme Court. And it's been almost 8 years and I still get chills. You know, the location of the building truly amplifies the work that we do. It amplifies the experience of educating for advocacy. It centers the work that we do hand in hand with other United Methodists through organizing. It, you know, amplifies the work of advocacy that we do on Capitol Hill. And the building provides this physical place of influence and provides a place for United Methodists all over to gather to do good and justice-centered work. So yeah, I think about the next 100 years and I'm excited. I really am to be able to continue this journey with those United Methodists of the past and of the future. So yeah.
Thank you, Amy. So we're going to try to answer a few questions. We don't have a whole lot of time left. I do want to say, if we don't get to your question, that we encourage you can send us an email at gbcs@umcjustice.org. And with a question, comments, if you need more information on something or looking for resources, just feel free to do that. So Mark, I know you kind of answered the question about the policing bill being dead. Did you want to expand on that a little more in terms of what happened with that bill?
There was negotiations in the Senate between Republicans and Democrats. I'll just leave it at that. All right. It turns out that the agreement could not be reached on how to go forward, particularly on dealing with an issue around when police do something, how I can't, what's that word? Indemnity? I forget that term that's used. And they couldn't come to agreement around that. So that was important in far as how do you hold police accountable? And the Republicans, from our view, was too busy listening to the police, even though the Democrats had police on their side. So now that bill will not go forward. So we work with a group called the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And I called them and they were the ones who informed me that they are working on a toolkit that will help people do policing in your state and in your local area. There are some localities that have taken some major steps on policing reform. So that information, once that is done, we hope to get it out and share it with you. So that's all. That's what my understanding is what's happening. We are in the process of going to be hiring someone, as Susan, to do the civil and human rights portfolio. And sometimes, so I'm kind of covering some of these issues until this happens. All right.
Thank you, Mark. So I also have kind of a more general question. Susan, maybe you want to start with this. And that's, why are United Methodists and Christians in general called to pursue social justice?
Thank you. I like that question. The reading of the gospel almost everywhere tells us about Jesus' care for those on the margins, those who are most vulnerable. And it is the way of Christian faith to care for and to advocate for those who are the most vulnerable in life. And we read that throughout the Gospels. And then we move to John Wesley, and you all, many of you, most of you may know the story of John Wesley and his commitment to social justice and social holiness, which was the language that he used. You remember that he was committed to having people living in poverty have a way out. He favored education for girls, which was very unheard of in those days. There was drastic calls for prison reform and caring for those who live in the conditions of poverty. Our work is the work of faith. It is the work of the gospel, and it is the work of the church. The United Methodist Church, as many of you know, passes legislation every 4 years, including resolutions of things that state that which we believe. Those are called the social principles and the resolutions. So we always have, as Mark showed you, we have the book of resolutions that speak on many, many issues. And that is the core of what we work on. So we do not make this up. Thank you, Mark. We are doing what the church has said the church is committed to doing. And it's based on the gospel. And it is work about justice on behalf of the people of God. So that is what we do. We do it in Washington, D.C. We do it at the United Nations, and we do it in capitals in the United States and all around the world. So that is my response.
Okay, and maybe just as a quick follow-up, there are obviously many advocacy groups on Capitol Hill, but Jesse, I'm wondering how theological reflection can be combined with advocacy.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think as Mark noted, the work of advocacy, and Amy noted this too, when Amy, you talked about that deeper experience, that there's a way when the Council of Bishops prayed over Chaplain Black, or when we're coming, there's this reflection about the ways that we are coming from a place and a center of the divine, from God. And so it has a deeper recognition of what our colleague Levy would talk about, which is the human dignity of every person. It's not out of self-interest. It's not out of our own kind of, as Mark said, we're not trying to gain more for the General Board of Church and Society. We're trying to better the world through this lens of recognizing that the divine works through and with us. And I think also the tools of prayer and fasting, the tools and means of grace, if you will, are things that we can call on when we find ourselves up against barriers to just and durable policies.
Thank you, Jesse. And one question from a ways back. Mark, you had mentioned a climate bill, and the question is, which bill did you have in mind?
Well, I'm going to do my best to answer that question. I was trying to get in contact with John Hill on our staff, who does our climate work, our lead staff person on that, and my boss, by the way, besides Susan. If you go to our webpage, you will see some principles of what we're calling for on climate justice. You have that. The administration has put money into the Build Back Better to address some climate and health issues, like I call it what is the lead pipes and helping communities deal with climate issues in their locations. If someone else wants to jump in there to go more into that, I would appreciate it. But there is money in the Build Back Better to address climate change and health for people.
Thank you, Mark. And we're almost out of time, but maybe just one quick thing. And this can be for whoever wants to respond. Members of the LGBTQ community are in the margins, what message do you have for us?
I'm happy to talk about that. Thank you for the question. The United Methodist Church has a very mixed history on many issues related to human dignity and human rights, and the care for LGBTQ people is one of those issues. The General Board of Church and Society has for 30 years supported the rights of non-discrimination against LGBTQ persons. And so the Book of Discipline is very clear on our commitment of the church's commitment on human rights and non-discrimination. Part of the problem in the church is its own internal struggle against LGBTQ people in ordination and ministry. In terms of the dignity and the rights issue, the church has been clear on that issue, but the church's internal struggle with the issues around LGBTQ people being ordained for ministry in the church is one with which we still struggle. And we must continue to pray, we must continue to be inclusive, and we must continue to be a church of justice.
One more thing to Susan's point, we do support the Equality Act.
Thank you.
Against discrimination against LGBTQ community.
Linda, can I say one more thing?
Sure.
It's not about LGBTQ explicitly. It is about our ecumenical relationships. And in the building, we have about 40 faith partners that live and work in the building. And many of our faith communities and faith partners work on different aspects of justice issues. And that is something that we didn't highlight today. That might be forthcoming in another webinar. But I do want to say that our work is intimately tied to our ecumenical and interfaith relationships.
Okay, thank you, Susan, and thank you to all our panelists. I see that the website and the email address were both in the chat, and of course there's always Google. But we want to thank you for spending your time with us today and spending this hour with us. A link to the recording will be sent in a separate email, so you'll be able to review it if you want. Again, thank you very much for participating and joining us today.